Good day. Today is Thursday, 8th May 2025. In much of the Western world, in Britain, where I live, today is celebrated as Victory Day, victory over Germany in the Second World War, or as the British call it, or used to call it, Victory in Europe Day. The Russians, along with most of the former Soviet republics, but importantly not Ukraine, celebrate the victory over Germany on the 9th of May. For those who are historically interested, the reason for this discrepancy is that the Germans, the German High Command, the German military leadership, signed a document of capitulation in front of the British military commander, overall military commander, Field Marshal Montgomery, on Lüneburg Heath in Germany. On the 8th of May, the Soviets, when they learnt about this, were furious because, after all, they were an ally of the British and of the other Allied powers, and they insisted that there had to be another surrender ceremony to confirm that they were also party to the capitulation of Germany, and that took place on the 9th of May. Well, I think that we should not dwell on these differences in dates between the West and the Russians. There's been far too many of these arguments and differences about the interpretations of the Second World War. For the record, the historian Jeff Roberts, who I consider a personal friend, has written a fine piece in Brave New Europe in which he discusses many of the arguments of interpretation about the history of the Second World War and rebuts many of the claims that are made, at least as far as I'm concerned, rebuts them comprehensively and effectively, which attempt in some way to place at least partial responsibility for the war on the Soviet Union, a claim which I personally find offensive, but, well, there we go. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on these things. For those people, these differences and divisions, particularly not on the occasion of these holidays, for the record, what I want to do, and all I'm going to do now, is wish everybody who is celebrating victory over the German leadership, the regime that existed in Germany, a leadership which the former British diplomat Ian Proud, someone else, by the way, who I count as a friend, has discussed thoroughly in his latest piece on the Substack blog, The Peacemonger, the regime that amounted to and the kind of regime it was. Anyway, I wish to congratulate everybody who celebrates that victory today on this day. Well, let us now move on to the topics of discussion in this program. And yesterday in my video, I discussed the current conflict between India and Pakistan. And I'm going to return very briefly at the start of this program to this subject, though I do not intend in this program to devote much more time to it. I'm going to make a rather bold claim, which is that though there has indeed been military exchanges between India and Pakistan over the last couple of days and hours, in fact, when one tries to peer through the heavy fog of war that I think is being intentionally created, one will see that actually rather less is happening than some people on each side would lead us to think. Briefly, I think, it is absolutely clear that India did launch airstrikes and missile strikes on bases, terrorist infrastructure, as they would say, within Pakistani territory. But it is also clear that the Indian authorities are not seeking a wider escalation. They have made claims, and I don't have any reason to dispute these claims, that they specifically targeted the facilities of the group that carried out the attack, or which they believe carried out the attack in Kashmir. They did not seek to attack installations of the Pakistani military. They're claiming that their attack was successful. They're producing various pictures that suggest that the attack was indeed successful, or at any rate that it did significant damage. I'm not myself, as I've said many times, there. I don't know exactly what happened, but I've no reason to doubt these pictures in any significant or substantial way. So that's what the Indians are saying. It seems to me that the implication of Indian statements, when you unpack them, is that the Indians have carried out the blow that they intended to make. They've made their point. They've shown that they are strong and tough and will act resolutely to defend their territory and their people, what they claim to be their territory, and what is unquestionably their people. And as far as the Indian government is concerned, I think this is as far as they want to take this matter as well. Now, on the Pakistani side, there have been many claims about the shooting down of Indian fighter jets. These have been accepted by many people as true, and an Indian newspaper, The Hindu, briefly published an article that seemed to accept at least some of these claims as true, though the article came in for heavy criticism within India itself and was retracted. Now, again, to repeat, I am not fully familiar with the facts because I cannot be. I am observing the situation from London. The Indian High Command doesn't share its secrets with me, and neither does the Pakistani High Command. I have looked at the information that has been presented. There's been reports from France that the Indian government has informed France that one Rafale fighter jet supplied by France was lost over the course of this operation, presumably shot down by Pakistan. I think that there is significant photographic evidence which appears to confirm that fact. There appears to be photographs of what those who are much more expert about these matters than I am say is parts of the engine of a Rafale fighter jet lying on the ground, suggesting that a Rafale fighter jet, was indeed shot down. And there are also scattered reports that the pilot was able to escape and parachute out of the plane before it crashed, and that he is well and safe. Now, that is the only evidence that I have seen that an Indian fighter jet was indeed shot down over the course of this operation. I have no reason to doubt that this evidence is correct. Maybe more Indian fighter jets were shot down than I know of, but it seems to me that the evidence for the moment points to only one. So Pakistan is making stronger claims. They're claiming to have shot down more fighter jets. They've talked about retaliation against Indian territory. There's some reports, there were some pictures which suggested some Pakistani missiles fired into Indian territory. But again, I don't get the sense that this amounted to very much, and I've been reading reports in various places which suggest that the Pakistani authorities understand very well that Pakistan is not at the present time in good shape to sustain a prolonged conflict with India. So I suspect that in Pakistan also a decision is quietly being made to pocket whatever credit there is from the shooting down of this one or more Indian aircraft and leave it at that. Now, I may be wrong. It may be that over the course of the next couple of days, the situation will escalate. But if I am right, and I'm not sure definitely that I am, then probably we are past the most dangerous moment in this affair. Now, I'm going to move on from discussing this conflict for the moment. I've already, I think, said all that I can about this particular incident that has currently arisen over the course of various programs. But I would like to mention some rather interesting comments that have been made over the last couple of days by the Pakistani Defense Minister, Khawaja Mohammad Asif. Now, he made these comments over the course of an interview with Sky News, and I've only recently become acquainted with them. You can find a detailed summary of these comments on Larry Johnson's invaluable blog, Sonar 21, and they are extremely interesting. So I'm going to just read a few of the things that Larry Johnson says, but you can also you can track down the interview itself on Sky News, and you can hear Mr. Asif explaining things directly. He said that in the past, Pakistan had indeed supported and funded terrorist groups and had done so for about 3 decades. He described this as doing the dirty work for the United States and the West, including Britain. He acknowledged that this was a mistake and that Pakistan had suffered greatly as a result, especially by aligning with the West during the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s and the post-9/11 US-led War on Terror. And he said that if Pakistan had not joined these efforts, its international record would have been unimpeachable. Now, these are really quite startling admissions. For the record, I think that in the main, they are correct. Certainly, I think Pakistan's role in the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s was entirely counterproductive as far as Pakistan itself was concerned. It involved Pakistan in Afghan affairs, by no means to its long-term advantage, creating major destabilization within Pakistan itself. And I think that problems that Pakistan continues to wrestle with are attributable in no small part to the role that Pakistan played in that conflict and in other conflicts, which, as Mr. Asif correctly says, Pakistan acted essentially on behalf of the West, the United States, the West, including Britain. I would say not just including Britain, but especially Britain. I would also say that these comments do appear to me to be intended, at least to some extent, as an overture to Russia, saying to the Russians, look, we know we did wrong by you in the past. Our support for the people you were fighting in Afghanistan was a terrible mistake, one for which we have paid a terrible price. We bitterly regret what we have done, and we would never do that again. And could it be that lurking behind some of these admissions of wrongs done in the past, there is also an admission and covert apology, perhaps made more openly in private to the Russians for the disastrous decision, which was apparently made over the course of the last 2 years, to supply Ukraine with artillery rounds. Clearly, that will not have made Pakistan any friends in Moscow, and I suspect that the Pakistanis, who, as I discussed in a recent program, appeared when the situation was getting out of control to be contacting the Russians to try to get the Russians to use their good offices with India to bring the crisis under control. I wonder whether the Pakistanis in private have made clear to the Russians that they recognize that just as their support for the insurgency in Afghanistan in the 1980s was a mistake, so was the arming of Ukraine also. Anyway, very interesting comments from Defense Minister Asif. Obviously, again, he hasn't spoken to me. I haven't been in private discussion about him. I'm making some guesses here. I think they're probably not far off from the truth. However, I did find these interesting comments, and the specific reference to Pakistan's mistake in involving itself in the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s was, as far as I can see, very revealing indeed. It does look to me like some kind of an overture to Russia. Probably there have been many more made privately as well. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this conflict for the moment. My hope and my belief is that it is now abating. Now, let's move on and discuss the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And lots of important things have been happening over the last couple of hours. And, well, today marks the first day of the victory celebration ceasefire that President Putin declared unilaterally some days ago. Now, when President Putin did declare that ceasefire some days ago, I said that to my knowledge, these repeated ceasefires that President Putin declares are deeply annoying to the Russian military and cause amongst the military intense frustration. And I strongly suspect that this ceasefire is no different. But it's become, I think, increasingly clear to me that the reason this ceasefire was declared in the way that it was connected in this case with the arrival of a large number of foreign leaders to Moscow. They have been arriving in Moscow since yesterday. President Xi Jinping of China arrived in Moscow. Lula of Brazil also. The presidents of Ethiopia and Egypt arrived, I believe, today. The Serbian president, Mr. Vučić, has also arrived in Moscow, apparently recovered from his illness. There were attempts by some EU states, notably the Baltic states, to prevent his aircraft reaching Moscow, which has provoked a stinging rebuke from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. But anyway, it didn't succeed. Vučić did arrive in Moscow. There's film of him there now giving interviews. I believe that Robert Fico is in Moscow as well. And leaders of all sorts of other countries are arriving in Moscow too. President Maduro of Venezuela, the president of Cuba, I believe the president of Mongolia, all sorts of countries, many of the countries of the former Soviet Union, they're all turning up in Moscow for the celebrations of Victory Day tomorrow. And amongst those who are there, I notice that Mr. Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, is there, as is Mr. Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia. Apparently, they've both turned up and will be there for this for these events, for these ceremonies also. Now, given the arrival of all of these important people in Moscow over the last couple of days, and I believe that they are continuing to arrive even as I'm making this program, then the announcement of the ceasefire begins to make complete sense, because Putin will have wanted to reassure all these leaders that the Russian leadership is doing everything within its power to try to guarantee their safety, and announcing a ceasefire over the course of the celebrations whilst all of these leaders are in Moscow, and calling on the Ukrainians to respect that ceasefire, ensuring the safety of these foreign visitors during the celebration makes complete sense. So I think this time we can say that Putin's ceasefire declaration was an appropriate and intelligent response to the situation, the current situation, and one which all of these important foreign visitors will have appreciated. Now, Zelensky's reaction has been completely different. He has publicly rejected the ceasefire. He's complained angrily that Ukraine doesn't want a ceasefire for 3 days. It wants a ceasefire for a minimum of 30 days. That this 3-day ceasefire unilaterally announced by President Putin won't do, that it's almost insulting that President Putin should announce such a ceasefire at all. At least that seems to be the tone of what President Zelensky has been saying. So he has, in public at least, rejected the ceasefire. And his words have been backed by deeds, because one of the most astonishing things over the last couple of days has been the enormous drone offensive that Ukraine has been conducting against Western Russia, targets across Western Russia, but specifically against the city of Moscow. All of yesterday, I was getting reports, even as important leaders like President Xi Jinping and President Lula were arriving, even as their jets were arriving at the various Moscow airports. All of yesterday, I was reading and hearing reports about Ukrainian drones flying towards Moscow, being shot down by the Russian air defenses. Now, I have to say this has, on Zelensky's side, and not just, of course, Zelensky, because the entire Ukrainian political and military leadership is as one with him on this, a fundamentally obsessional side. Now, I say that with some qualification. Ukraine, as far as it's concerned, has been attacked by Russia. The Ukrainians are unsurprisingly furious about this. They sense that they're losing the war. In fact, they are losing the war. It's entirely understandable that they are angry and that they are hitting out at the Russians, as they would say, in every possible way that they can. But there is that phrase, which is absolutely true, that decisions made in anger are repented at leisure. And launching hundreds of drones at Moscow, trying to disrupt celebrations on Victory Day, trying ultimately to interfere with the arrival of foreign leaders in Moscow, seems to me to be misconceived to the point of, well, irrationality. What exactly does Zelensky and his officials, what did they think precisely that they are doing? Are they intending to show to all of these leaders that Ukraine is still fighting? Why do they need to show them that? Are they trying to deter these leaders from coming to Moscow at all? If so, none has been deterred. Not one of them that I have seen has been deterred. Are they trying to impress these leaders by Ukraine's steely determination in the face of the Russian advance? Well, if so, I think it is a pointless exercise. What they're really doing, all that they're really doing, is establishing in the minds of these leaders a contrast between what the Russians have tried to do, which is organize a ceasefire on this particular holiday, so that these leaders can participate unhindered and in safety in the celebrations in Moscow, with what the Ukrainians have done over the same period, which is try to disrupt the celebrations and do so in ways which notionally at least might at least put the leaders in an uncomfortable position and even just possibly a dangerous one. I cannot imagine that anybody, any foreign leader arriving in Moscow at this time in the middle of a drone storm is going to look any more favourably upon Ukraine than they had been doing so, more favourably upon Ukraine than they had been doing so previously. On the contrary, I think deep down, many of them are going to be very angry, and they're going to be saying to themselves that Putin and the Russians are absolutely right. These people are impossible. They are being completely unreasonable. They show no respect for the leaders of other countries. They treat anybody who isn't 100% with them as not just 100% against them, but practically as an enemy. And obviously that is not a wise thing to do. Now, in the case of China, it gets even worse, because for several weeks now, President Zelensky and his officials have been cranking up the rhetoric against China, criticizing China, making claims that Chinese troops are fighting on the borderlands alongside the Russians, producing photos of two Chinese soldiers who the Ukrainians say are there because the Chinese military wants them to be there, but who more likely are just Chinese volunteers. They've been making accusations that China has been helping Russia by supplying weapons to Russia, or at least component parts for weapons. They've been escalating the rhetoric against China almost continuously. And one can, to some extent, understand the logic of this, because, of course, China currently is in a major confrontation with the United States. In fact, one could argue that China and the United States are currently in a condition of economic war with each other. And, well, at this particular moment in time, the United States is very hostile to China and probably likely to remain so, and considers China to be the US's greatest and most dangerous enemy. So perhaps, presumably, the thinking in Kiev is that if you talk up the threat from China to Ukraine, then that will make the United States more sympathetic to Ukraine. If that is the thinking, then I would say immediately that the logic is profoundly flawed. China has, over the last 3.5 years, sought to maintain a certain distance from the war. On the one hand, it has moved forward with its strategic partnership with Russia. It has continued to do massive business with Russia. It has refused to support sanctions against Russia. It invests in the Russian economy. It does energy deals with Russia. It does many things. Perhaps it has supplied some dual-use technologies to Russia. I don't know that it has, but I'm willing to believe that it has done. Maybe it has also provided some military supplies to Russia too. Certainly I have seen film of Chinese cross-country vehicles, off-road vehicles, operated by sections of the Russian military, for example, in the conflict area. But then it's perhaps worth pointing out that Ukraine has also used Chinese-made civilian equipment and adapted it for military uses as well, including, by the way, for a long time, in its drones. So that is not conclusive, but perhaps China has provided more assistance going beyond that. Maybe it's provided Russia, for example, with chips. Maybe it's provided Russia with some degree of intelligence assistance, though I'm not sure that China has a more comprehensive satellite array monitoring the situation in Ukraine specifically than Russia does. So I'm not sure that the Chinese are in a position to provide much in the way of additional support to Russia in this area. But anyway, maybe the Chinese have done certain things to help the Russians. But if they have, it has been very low key and very, very under the radar. Of course, if the Chinese were to decide to go all in and to support the Russians, well, as a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said some weeks ago, if that really were to happen, the results, the consequences would be very great and would be very visible, and the impact would be immediate. To repeat again, point I made in many programs, China has the biggest industrial base in the world by far. It is the world's manufacturing colossus. Its manufacturing industry is greater than that of the entire collective West, including South Korea and Japan, combined. That is what I've been told. That is what I believe. China has enormous amount of spare industrial capacity. It is by far the world's biggest producer of steel. I believe the difference is on this kind of scale. I mean, it produces around 10 times more steel in a year or in a month than either the United States or Russia do. Just saying. If, for example, China were to start producing artillery shells for the Russian military, which I suspect it could start to do very fast, even though I understand that the Chinese military uses the 155mm caliber round, not the 152mm round that the Russians use. But I am confident that Chinese factories, given the enormous industrial and engineering reserves that the Chinese have, could convert factories and deploy factories and industrial space and skilled workers to produce 152mm shells for the Russians very quickly if asked to. Well, if the Chinese started to do that, you would not be getting 3 or 4 or 10 or even 14 million shells on the Russian side. You would probably be getting multiples of that number. If the Chinese started to commit to produce drones for the Russians, you would see the sky darken over Ukraine, given with the number of drones that China could produce. It would swamp anything that Ukraine or the West could put together. it would hasten the end of the war incredibly quickly. It would make a decisive change to the war. Now, the Chinese have not done that up to now. The Russians, as far as I can see, have never asked them to. I think that it is important to the Russians that they win this war by themselves. And besides, there are extremely good strategic reasons why China and Russia do not want to go that far, whereby China, in effect, is arming Russia, because that would signal that the two countries are indeed military allies, and that is something that they have both striven to avoid. But whatever you may think about that, if you are Ukrainian, you absolutely do not want the Chinese antagonized and deciding to take a personal role on the Russian side in this war. If, however, you actually do want to do that, if you really do want to involve China in the war, well, what better way to do it is there than to start sending fleets of drones towards Moscow at the very time when Xi Jinping is flying to that very city? If the Ukrainians want to provoke China into taking that kind of step, then they're going about it in exactly the right way. Now, I don't think the Chinese will be provoked to do that. I don't think the Russians want them to do that for the reasons that I said. It might hasten the Russian victory in Ukraine, but it would not then be a purely Russian victory. It would be a victory which the Russians would have achieved with Chinese help. And I can see that for reasons not just of national pride, but for self-confidence and for ability to navigate the future relationship with China, I suspect that that is not a position that the Russians want to find themselves in. But put all that aside, as I said, Chinese involvement in the war would be a catastrophe for Ukraine. Whatever help the United States would then provide would be colossally outmatched by the assistance that China would provide. And it makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever that the Ukrainians would want to behave in the way that they do. The obvious and correct strategy, one in the past which Ukraine has sort of tried to follow, is to try to maintain good relations with China, as Ukraine used to have in the past, if only so as to be able to reach out to China if the situation really does become critical for Ukraine, and hope that China will exercise its good offices in Moscow on Ukraine's behalf. After all, isn't that exactly what Pakistan has done in its conflict with India just now? Has it not reached out, as the Pakistani ambassador did, as the Pakistani defense minister did in the comments that I've just discussed earlier in this program? Has not Pakistan reached out to Russia to try to get Russia to use its good offices with India? Surely this is the proper strategy that a Ukrainian government ought to be following. But the Ukrainian government behaves constantly in its own way. It has been continuously fed with flattery by its European allies especially. Its leader, President Zelensky, has been lionized wherever he goes in Europe. He is hailed everywhere as a heroic figure and a colossal statesman, even though he is, to say it bluntly, none of those things. The Ukrainians have therefore become colossally entitled and resistant to anything that ultimately works to their long-term interests. And anyway, there it is. This has been bizarre behavior, but no more bizarre than so much else that we have seen over the course of the last 3 years, and indeed going all the way back to the 2014 crisis. No more bizarre than what the Ukrainians routinely do and get applauded for doing by the governments of the West. Now, there has been a narrative that has been plugged in the Western media over the last 24 hours that actually this is all a great masterstroke, militarily speaking, that launching all these hundreds of drones at Moscow and other cities is obliging the Russians to use up vast amounts of ammunition and equipment, shooting down all of these drones, and that is depleting Russian air defenses and is creating holes in Russia's air defense coverage on its western territories, enabling Ukraine to take advantage of that. And I've even been reading some reports in some media outlets that frontline positions of the Russian military are being burnt, supposedly, because all the air defenses, the Russian air defenses, have been concentrated in Moscow. May I say straight away that I think not only is that massively exaggerated, it is actually untrue. I think that the Russians, by this stage in the war, have developed a very sophisticated air defense system indeed, a highly layered air defense system. They have various equipment that they use to shoot down drones. I don't think that the drones that are attacking Moscow are being shot down to any great extent by surface-to-air missiles, for example. The pictures that have been appearing and the commentary that has been appearing in the Russian media suggests that they're being shot down using aerial cannon by Kamov-52 helicopter gunships, supplemented by MiG-35 fighter interceptors. And obviously, these helicopter gunships and fighter jets are able to patrol Moscow and deal with the drones, and no doubt they can be guided to their locations by Russian radar systems. It's important to say that these drones do have to travel a considerable distance before they can reach Moscow, so the Russians can, to a certain extent at least, track their movements. And the Russians know that they're coming, they're ready for them, and I don't think that they're depleting Russian air defenses to anything like the extent that is being alleged. And as for other targets around Russia, obviously the Russians can't defend every potential target that the drones can reach across the entire territory of their enormous country. But I think that there is more than enough air defense equipment, heavy caliber cannon and that kind of thing to defend the key sites. And from what I can see, the damage that these drones is doing is minimal. So far, at least, it seems that none of the drones that the Ukrainians have launched against Moscow have got through. I hope, by the way, that that continues for the rest of the holiday. There are rumours, they're only rumours, I can't say how true they are, that the Russians have given private warnings that if any drones do hit any part of the parade which is due to take place tomorrow, or do any damage or hurt or injure any of the foreign guests, then there will be a devastating reaction. There have been rumors that Putin has given instructions that Oreshnik missiles be prepared for that precise eventuality. Again, I don't know that this is true. The Russians do now undoubtedly possess a stockpile of Oreshnik missiles. They launched, as we all remember, Oreshnik missiles back in November last year, after the US and Britain and Ukraine began collectively to launch ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles into Russia. There's one Oreshnik that was used to attack the giant rocket factory in the city of Dnipro. But even at that time, the Russians were saying that they had more than one Oreshnik already in their arsenal, and that serial production of Oreshnik missiles was about to start. And I have heard that serial production of Oreshnik missiles has indeed started, and that it began in February, and that the production numbers are supposed to build to a total production of around 25 of these missiles every month, which sounds like a lot, but it's about the same number as I believe the United States could conceivably maximally produce Patriot missiles. So maybe it's not such a lot. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of that. But probably the Russians didn't produce 25 Oreshniks in February. When you start production, serial production of a new product, it usually takes several months, usually sometimes up to a year if it's a complicated product, such as I presume the Oreshnik is, to finally reach planned maximum production volumes. But let's say the Russians produced in February 5 Oreshnik missiles, and that the production numbers have gradually grown so that they produced 5 in February, maybe another 5 in March, perhaps 7 or 8 in April. Well, you have 17 or 18 Oreshnik missiles, plus whatever prototypes you built before serial production began, say 20 missiles. Given how powerful these missiles are, that is already a pretty formidable force, one that you could use to do a very extensive amount of damage if you were to put it into battle. So undoubtedly the ability to use Oreshniks in response to what the Ukrainians have done already exists and is there, but that doesn't mean that that is what the Russians want or are planning to do. I understand that the Russians don't intend to start using the Oreshnik on a regular basis on the Ukrainian battlefields until production has grown beyond preliminary levels and before a larger stockpile has been produced. And I've heard it suggested that August is probably around the time when we're going to start seeing them used more regularly. Anyway, that's what I've heard. But anyway, the rumours that the Oreshnik could be used are indeed out there and floating around. So it's not just drone strikes against Moscow that Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been conducting. They have also been making continuous attempts to break into Kursk region. And despite the fact that Putin's unilateral ceasefire kicked in last night, apparently, as of this morning, these Ukrainian attacks on the border, on the Kursk border, continue, and the fighting is apparently very intense. And it seems that the Ukrainians are taking very heavy losses. Now, again, to repeat, I am not there, but I have seen quite extensive film of the fighting, and I am reading a lot of reports, both on the Russian and the Ukrainian side. And the Ukrainian objective appears to be to try to capture a village on the border called Totkino, village which the Ukrainians never captured during their original Kursk offensive of August 2023. And there have even been some claims that if the Ukrainians actually do manage to capture Totkino and dig in there, then the objective would be not to stop at Totkino itself, but ultimately to advance deeper into Kursk region all over again, with perhaps the objective ultimately of reaching towns which the Ukrainians never did manage to capture during the original Kursk offensive, to try to capture places like Lzew and Lgov precisely, which incidentally, if the Ukrainians ever were to reach, Rilsk and Lgov would finally put them again within striking range of Kurchatov and the Kursk nuclear power plant that is located in that town, southwest of Kursk, and of course the depository with the tactical nuclear missiles, or rather warheads for the tactical nuclear missiles, which is said also to be in Kurchatov. Now, if that is the Ukrainian plan, it is, again, completely irrational. The idea that the Russians would this time be caught by surprise, as they supposedly were in August 2024. Of course, there is a view that they weren't caught by surprise at all, that they were laying a trap for the Ukrainians. But anyway, whatever it was that the Russians were doing in August 2024, this time, surely, the Russians know all about what the Ukrainians are up to. And even if Totkino were captured, there is no realistic way that the Ukrainians would be able to battle through to places like Rilsk, Lgov, or the nuclear power station in Kursk, in Kurchatov. I mean, such objectives, on any rational assessment, are now obviously completely out of reach. So what exactly are the Ukrainians doing? Why are they attacking Totkino? Well, Totkino, you put aside all these far-fetched theories of another Ukrainian offensive deep inside Kursk region. Totkino does lie in a kind of a salient. It's surrounded on three sides by Ukrainian territory. I should say it's right on the border. The Russians have not established what they would call a buffer zone on the Ukrainian side of the border. So the Ukrainians are quite close to Totkino and can shell it from three sides and send drones there. The border in this area has been fortified. The Russians have laid mines and they've planted anti-tank barriers, dragon's teeth, and that kind of thing. But in theory, at least, if you look at a map, then I suppose Totkino could look vulnerable, and maybe that's the plan. You capture Totkino, and then you might perhaps scare the Russians into thinking that places like Risk, Korenovo, Lgov, Kurchatov itself might be at risk, and that might provoke the Russians into diverting forces from other places. And, well, anyway, it would be a big propaganda win prior to the Victory Day celebrations on the 9th of May. A big propaganda win in the minds of the Ukrainians. I don't think anybody in Russia, outside the West, would be in the slightest impressed. They would almost definitely say, this is, again, another example of the Ukrainians behaving irrationally, allowing public relations to dictate their military strategies. Anyway, whatever. Just as with these drone attacks on Moscow, Zelensky and Syrskyi and all of them have doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on these attacks on Totkino. Now, as of the time of making of this program, every one of these attacks appears to have been defeated, and I've seen ample film, lots of Ukrainian losses, tanks, armoured vehicles destroyed, large numbers of engineering vehicles destroyed. It seems that the minefields, the Russian minefields, have not been cleared. It seems that passages have not been created through the minefields or the anti-tank barriers. It seems that the Russians have deployed significant forces, mainly paratroopers, but also a unit, a FPV drone unit to the area, which has been doing fearful damage to the Ukrainians, and of course the Russians outshell and outgun the Ukrainians. So once again, as with the attack on Moscow, difficult to understand rationally what it is the Ukrainians are seriously actually trying to do. But one gets the sense of a furious, angry regime, sensing that the war is going badly and striking out as hard as it can, hoping that somehow, if it captures territory in Russia, it will rattle the Russians in some way and achieve some kind of result, which I doubt that the Ukrainians can even coherently explain to themselves. Those of you who have read Moby Dick, know of Captain Ahab, will understand the kind of obsession, the kind of anger that I'm talking about, and the way it can result in action of this kind. Well, anyway, while all of this is going on, while Zelensky continues these attacks on Moscow and these attempts on the Kursk border, we now supposedly have a ceasefire, at least the Russians have declared one, across the rest of the contact line. Now, as it happens, over the last couple of weeks, but especially maybe over the last week, the Russians have made very considerable progress on every part of the contact line. They have, in particular, achieved significant breakthroughs, or so it seems to me, in 3 places. Or maybe I should say 4 places. Firstly, they seem to have restarted their offensive against Seversk from the west. They seem to have advanced and captured significant territory north of Verkhokamyanska, village to the west of Seversk. The Russians have positions in Verkhokamyanska. The village has been fought over, but they appear to have captured a lot of territory to the north of this village, and there are suggestions that they're planning to basically outflank the Ukrainian defenses in this village. If the whole of the village comes finally under Russian control, well, it is the last village leading to Siversk from the west. The Russians also are in control, apparently, or at least have expanded their control, in other areas around Siversk and to the west as well. And, well, a couple of days ago, the Russians captured a village in the Zherebets River area, a village called Nova, and they've apparently captured another village in that area over the last 24 hours, and they've expanded their territory that they control around Liman, and there are reports that they're also pushing south, ultimately towards Troitske and Yampol, and it does look as if there is a concerted attempt by the Russians now to break Ukrainian defenses in Siversk and perhaps to retake Liman as well. Now, a couple of days ago, we did on the Duran a program with Stanislav Krapivnik, who is a former military person. He served in the US military, but he's also from this area, and he knows the topography extremely well and the geography extremely well. And he explained over the course of the program that the capture of all of these places, Siversk, Liman, is essential, that it is the key to unlock the Slavyansk conurbation, the northern part of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. If the Russians are pushing towards this conurbation from the south, then Liman is apparently the key to breaking into this conurbation from the north. And of course, if you control Liman, you control Siversk, you stabilize and shorten the front lines, you're in a strong position then to make a move towards Slavyansk itself. If you control these two places, apparently you control the high ground, and that makes an attack on Slavyansk much easier than it would otherwise be. Now that brings me to the southern part of this conurbation, the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. And here it is perhaps more complicated, but in some ways more advanced. The Russians now control Toretsk. They've been making significant breakthroughs to the west of Toretsk, which have brought them close to the outskirts of Konstantinovka itself. They captured, over the last couple of days, a strategic village called Novoelyanovka, and there is some mystery, at least to me, as to the exact status of the situation in that long and complicated battle, which is Chasiv Yar. Because about a week ago, we were getting reports that the Ukrainians were facing a critical situation in the central area of Chasiv Yar. They were only clinging on there, and it looked as if the Russians were about to clear the central area of Chasiv Yar. And then, as I was waiting to learn about the capture of the central area of Chasiv Yar, suddenly instead a whole slew of reports started to appear, coming out over the following days, that the Russians had cleared and captured a very large territory immediately to the north of Chasiv Yar itself, a territory which some say is part of Chasiv Yar. I'm not quite clear in what way, but anyway, it looks as if Ukrainian resistance, if there has been any resistance in this area, has collapsed. Now, I am not at all clear as to the significance of the capture of this territory, though many of the commentators do seem to think it is very important indeed, and I'm not sure how this relates to any Ukrainian positions that continue to hold out in the central part of Chasiv Yar. But I've seen it suggested that this capture of this territory to the north does somehow impact on Ukrainian positions in central Chasiv Yar and perhaps makes them untenable, though I'm not sure how. I'm not a military man, so I'm not in a position to say. But anyway, one way or the other, it does look as if the Russians have consolidated their control in this area very significantly. And it looks as if they're preparing to finish the Battle of Chasiv Yar. Maybe the central area has already been captured, and that it's precisely because the Russians control the central part of Chasiv Yar that they're in a position to advance north in the way that they have done. It is very often the case in this war that facts on the ground far outrun the reports, and it could be that the Ukrainians have pulled out of the central area of Chasiv Yar, and that has released Russian forces to capture more territory to the north of Chasiv Yar. That is one possibility. I'm not arguing, by the way, that that is the case. But anyway, one way or the other, it looks as if the Russians are rapidly gaining control of all the high ground around Konstantinovka itself. And again, I suspect after the Victory Day celebrations in the second half of May, we will start to see concerted attempts to try to press home the advantage the Russians have achieved here and to begin the assault on Konstantinovka itself. So we can see how events are moving in this direction as well. And then there is very heavy fighting going on around Pokrovsk. The Russians have consolidated their positions to the south and southwest of Pokrovsk. There's uncertainty whether they hold ground inside Pokrovsk or not. There were reports some days ago that a Russian group had broken into southern Pokrovsk, and there were videos to this effect. Then it was claimed by the Ukrainians that these troops had been pushed out. The mappers, some of the mappers, are still showing a Russian presence on this territory. I don't know, one way or the other. Again, to repeat once more, I'm not able to, I'm not on the ground, so I cannot say. But regardless, there are very heavy Russian missile and artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions in southern Pokrovsk now. And it is difficult to see these as anything other than preparations for some kind of assault which is to come. And it may be, as Radovka was saying a couple of days ago, that the Russians have infiltrated their forces into southern Pokrovsk, and this artillery and missile barrage is intended to support their forces, or it could be more complicated than that. I'm not sure. But regardless, the Russians continue to advance significantly to the southwest of Pokrovsk and also to the northeast of Pokrovsk. And there are reports that over the last couple of days, the Russians have made a significant advance towards the village, the important village of Novopavlivka in Dnipro region, which apparently is seen as some kind of a logistics hub by the Ukrainians in this particular area. And again, if you look at a map and see where Novopavlivka is located, it's easy to see how if the Russians do eventually capture this village, and with reports that the Russians are advancing also somewhat to the north of this village as well, the entire communication system of Pokrovsk from the west could come under significant pressure. And in the northeast, the Russians apparently have now captured some, or maybe more than some, maybe more than half of the village of Malinivka. And they're closing in ultimately on the village of Novo Ekonomichne, just to the east of Pokrovsk, Mirnograd. And there's also reports that the Russians are looking to capture some villages even to the north of these places. And the point is that if they do that, then their advances to the west and to the north will cut all the main supply lines to Pokrovsk. So again, it's not difficult to understand what the Russians are doing. And here, as everywhere else, Ukrainian resistance is very ragged. Now, further south of Pokrovsk, the Russians, about a couple of days ago, broke into the fortified Ukrainian village of Bogatyr. There's said to be heavy fighting going on for control of this village. I assume, by the way, that this fighting will continue despite Putin's May 9th ceasefire. And further west, there is the continuous intrigue as to what exactly is going on in Kherson region and whether the Russians have indeed established a bridgehead on the west bank, the Ukrainian-controlled bank of the river, and whether they are really planning some kind of move against the city of Kherson as well. Last but not least, if we go back to the north, to Sumy and Kharkiv regions, group of forces north seems to be clearing positions around Volchansk, and we still get reports of further Russian advances in Sumy region. There's talk about setting up buffer zones to protect the border, the Russian border. But it's always possible that buffer zones can become positions for further advances, perhaps towards the cities of Sumy and even Kharkiv itself. Well, I provided an update of the military position. The key thing to say is that everywhere, in every single location of the front lines, the Russians are advancing. They're pushing forward, something which, as I have said in previous programs, they have never done in this war before. And all of this is happening before the big blow falls, before the two big reserve armies are thrown into battle, as I predict they will be, before the Oreshnik missiles are activated during the summer months, during the dry season. And, well, there is apparently a report circulating in the United States that originates from the US intelligence community. Apparently Pete Hegseth has referenced it, which confirms or says that there is no single item of military equipment or quantity of military equipment that the United States can reasonably hope to supply to Ukraine without depleting its own inventories further and critically, that can change the overall direction of events on the battlefronts. Now that then brings me back to this tedious subject, and it is a tedious subject. It's become so, at least for me, which is the diplomacy that the United States is conducting. Now, I ought to say that at the moment, all the indications from the Russians is that their primary focus is on prosecuting the war. The Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has actually said in an interview with a Vietnamese newspaper, in an article he's written in a Vietnamese newspaper, that there is no benefit for Russia in agreeing to a ceasefire unless the underlying issues of the conflict are first addressed. And the Russian foreign ministry spokesman has basically repeated these words. She says that the Russians are by no means averse to the theory of a ceasefire, but a ceasefire is only meaningful if steps are taken to ensure that it is effective, which with the Ukrainians it never is, and that before there is a ceasefire anyway, there needs to be, especially in light of the earlier history, some serious attempt to address some assurance that the underlying issues of the conflict will be addressed and that a peace settlement, which is a peace settlement that Russia will accept, is agreed. So this is the Russian position. But as I said, overall, my strong sense, reading the Russian media, listening to what Russian officials are saying, is that not only are they not retreating from Istanbul, plus Putin's proposals outlined to the foreign ministry in Russia on the 14th of June 2024, but that their primary focus is the war, prosecuting the war. They don't really believe that peace is coming or is anywhere on the horizon. They insist that the job has to be finished and won on the battlefields. Now, the United States made all kinds of diplomatic initiatives after President Trump was inaugurated. And one of the things that has become even clearer over the last couple of hours is that there is a stark difference and division of opinion within the administration. The US Vice President, J.D. Vance, has made some very interesting comments, which, by the way, have not been, in my opinion, properly reported in the media in the West. He said these comments at a security conference in the United States. He said that the United States is no longer focused on achieving a ceasefire because Russia is clearly unhappy with that idea. The United States, however, still wants to see peace achieved in Ukraine. It's not convinced, it's not certain that it can be, but that remains its objective, and that the route towards achieving that objective is through direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, though the United States itself would be prepared to be involved. And he said that the Russians have made demands, but that their demands go too far, though that presumably will be something that will be sorted out over the course of the negotiations. In the British media especially, there's Vance's comments about the Russians demanding too much has been basically the only part of his comments that has been attracted attention and had been highlighted. The fact that Vance says that the United States is no longer seeking to broker a ceasefire, but wants direct negotiations to begin between Ukraine and Russia. Those are not being given the same emphasis. And that is surprising because that marks a decisive break from the American position. The American position for the first couple of weeks, right up to the middle of April, was to seek a ceasefire. Then around April, just before the presentation of the American plans to the Ukrainians and the Europeans in Paris and London, the Americans started to come up with ideas that might address some of the issues that the Russians were worried about, like NATO membership for Ukraine, which supposedly was being taken off the table, whatever that means, and some of the territorial issues. Now, according to Vance, the US is moving even further towards the Russian position. The Russians have set out what their terms are, but they've always said that they're prepared to negotiate directly with the Ukrainians, to sit down with the Ukrainians and negotiate with them without conditions. And, well, they've never said that they would modify their terms if there were negotiations. They have nonetheless said that they are ready for negotiations. Now, the Ukrainians have consistently rejected negotiations. Zelensky has made that point completely clear. He's passed a law, a decree. He made a decree in October 2022 that forbade negotiations with the Russians. He has given indications that he is prepared to speak to the Russians, negotiate with the Russians, if there is a ceasefire. But the Ukrainian-European proposals that were presented about 2 weeks ago, which alongside the same meeting where the American proposals were presented, make it absolutely clear that as far as Zelensky is concerned, the only purpose of negotiations is ultimately to achieve a Russian capitulation. I have discussed in previous programs the extraordinary nature of the Ukrainian-European proposal, and I have also said that it's obviously one that the Russians are never going to accept at a time when they're winning the war. Anyway, Zelensky does not agree to negotiations in the way that Vance appears to think he should, and as the Russians are proposing. So that actually puts Vance closer to the Russian position than to Zelensky's position. Now, that's what Vance is saying. But then another American, a member of the administration, has been working the networks and has been talking as well. And that is General Kellogg. And he's taking a completely different position, as far as I can tell, to Vance, because Kellogg still seems to be talking about a ceasefire. He's now openly talking about freezing the conflict, something which the Russians have consistently rejected, something which the Ukrainians have also, by the way, historically rejected. He's been talking about freezing the conflict. He's been talking about creating a demilitarized zone. He continues to speak about European peacekeepers being deployed to Ukraine to enforce the ceasefire that is going to be put in place. He clearly envisages no limits to the size of the Ukrainian armed forces and to the extent of its re-equipment. And, well, he doesn't talk very much about NATO, but as I discussed in a previous program, the New York Times recently said that US officials reassured the Ukrainians at the meeting in London that a future administration might be prepared to reopen the question of Ukraine joining NATO after Donald Trump had departed from the scene. So in effect, that official logically can only have been Kellogg, and it seems that Kellogg still imagines a future in which Ukraine joins NATO. So it seems to me that Vance is outlining one set of ideas and Kellogg is outlining a completely different set of ideas. The fact that the Ukrainians don't even like Kellogg's ideas doesn't seem to deter Kellogg. The fact that both the Russians and the Ukrainians have rejected his plan doesn't seem to have influenced him especially. He, by the way, also imagines a future reality when the territories are returned to Ukraine as well. He's making it very clear that even if the United States were to recognize the four regions de facto as Russian, that doesn't preclude Ukraine one day reacquiring them. So, despite the fact that the Ukrainians are not keen on his plan, despite the fact that the Russians have rejected it outright, he still talks, he goes on to talk shows, he follows programs, he continues to insist that it is his plan, which is the administration's plan, and which is the one that is going forward. Now, I'm tempted to say that Kellogg, should talk to Vance, because, as I said, Vance clearly has a completely different set of ideas. a much more realistic set of ideas, which is that ceasefires, freezes, all of that is absolutely hopeless at this time. However, the Russians have agreed to negotiations. It's time that the Ukrainians did as well. And let's forget about ceasefires, but at least get some kind of dialogue going. And who knows, out of that dialogue, something might come. Now, I am completely unable to see which side the president himself is supporting. And I wonder whether the president himself knows. Indeed, he clearly for the moment continues to go with Kellogg. We've had the minerals right deal, the investment deal, which is now navigating its way through the Ukrainian parliament. The Ukrainian parliament is very unhappy that they haven't been shown the limited partnership agreement. I have been told, by the way, and I accept this completely, that there are specific prohibitions under US law to publishing agreements like the limited partnership agreement, that these types of agreement are heavily protected in the United States by commercial privacy considerations. I've also seen claims that the limited partnership agreement, an analysis of what made by people who claim to have seen the limited partnership agreement, that in reality, the agreements, the whole package of agreements is very, very heavily tilted again towards the United States, much more so than the draft agreement, rather the main agreement, which is the one which has been published and which we have seen. Well, all of that may be true, but the point is that the fact that there's been this agreement made at all, as Eve Smith has correctly pointed out, and as Marjorie Taylor Greene and others worry about, that does seem to renew US commitment to Ukraine. And in the meantime, we see that these plans to dust off old Patriot missile systems in Israel and perhaps in Germany are being revived. And we also see that these enormous drone attacks that Zelensky is conducting against Moscow appear to elicit no word of complaint from the administration or from Donald Trump. A few weeks ago, Trump spoke angrily about the fact that the Russians had conducted missile strikes on Kiev, missile and drone strikes on Kiev. He is saying nothing at all about Ukrainian drone strikes on Moscow in connection with the Victory Day celebrations. Now, the Russian strike was very effective and some civilians were killed. The Ukrainian strike has been completely ineffective, and as of the time of making of this program, it seems that no one at all has been killed. But the intention to strike at the other side's capital is presumably the same, but Trump has condemned the one that was done by the Russians, and said nothing about the other, the one that is now being done by Ukraine, even as world leaders gather in Moscow. Some of them, people like Xi Jinping, people whom Trump presumably at some point wants to meet and speak to. So there is a contrast, and I have to say overall, the sense is that Trump at the moment is definitely leaning more still towards the Kellogg side. It could be that, as I said, he is nervous of what Lindsey Graham and his cohort in the Senate, 72 senators apparently, might get up to. And at the moment he is appeasing them. Or it could be that he is indeed frustrated that Putin hasn't agreed to the ceasefire, which he expected that Putin would agree to, and that he's taking out his anger on Putin. Or, perhaps more probable of all, he is terrified of appearing weak and doesn't want to be seen making concessions to the Russians, and for that reason he's still backing Kellogg and his plan, even though that isn't leading anywhere. Anyway, Trump continues this tiresome litany that unless there is a breakthrough soon, he will walk away. I've been hearing that now for weeks. I've long since given up believing that that is ever going to happen. So he talks in this way. I don't think he's yet made a final decision. Now, there are some claims that Ukraine's stockpile of weapons will begin to run out. There'll be critical shortages of Ukrainian weapons in about a month's time. And the other thing to say is that I suspect that in a month's time, we're going to start to see further big movements on the ground. As I've discussed, Russian operations up to now have been mostly shaping operations conducted by the forces in place. That is not going to continue for very much longer. So Trump is going to have to make a decision. At some point, either he acknowledges that Kellogg is being completely unrealistic and is pulling him back into the conflict in Ukraine, and that in turn is antagonizing people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are Trump's core political base, or he decides to realign fully with the neocons and returns to American support for Ukraine. He cannot continue to ride these two horses at one and the same time. So he's got a decision to make. And the Russians, as I've said, they've made theirs, prosecuting the war until victory is their objective. They haven't told us what their conception of a full victory is, but Medvedev has made another fiery speech in which he talks about regime change in Kiev, and I cannot see the Russians accepting anything less. So at some point, Trump needs to understand that that is probably where the Russians are going, and he's also got to take into consideration the advice he's been given by his own intelligence people and by the Pentagon, that the United States doesn't have the means to turn this round. Whether he will do that or not, whether he's able to do that, whether he'll just go on dithering and prevaricating through the summer, I don't know. But it is at least refreshing to know from J.D. Vance's comments that there are indeed people in the administration who do have a much more realistic understanding of the realities, certainly than Kellogg does, and then perhaps Trump does too. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.